Open the door.
That's far enough. Hands where I can see them. Who are you?
You already see the blood. Nora Dane.
The gun wasn't loaded. Nora Dane didn't know that when she raised her eyes and stared down the barrel without flinching. She would find out later, much later, after everything had burned and been rebuilt from ash. But in that first moment, standing on the porch of a dying ranch with ice in her hair and blood on her knuckles, all she knew was that the man holding the gun had the kind of eyes that had seen too much and forgiven nothing. Ridley Cole was 6 feet of weathered muscle and bad history. He stood in the doorway of Sagebrush Ridge like a king in a crumbling castle, the rifle loose in his hands but ready. The way a man holds a weapon when using it isn't a question of if but when. He was somewhere north of 40, with a jaw like carved granite and a silence around him that felt less like peace and more like a storm that had already decided where it was going to hit. He looked at her the way men look at problems they didn't invite. "You got about 10 seconds, he said, to tell me why I shouldn't close this door." Nora didn't blink, "Because you need workers and I need work. And because if you close that door, you'll find me frozen on your porch come morning. And that'll be a worse problem than whatever you think I am right now." He studied her, really studied her the way a man studies terrain before he crosses it. She was young, mid-20s maybe, hard to tell under the grime and the cold. Her jacket was denim, thin as paper, soaked through and hanging off her shoulders like something defeated. Her dark hair was plastered flat against her skull. There was blood on her right hand, dried and crusted at the knuckles, and it wasn't from anyone else. She'd cut her palm changing a tire on a dark road 20 miles back. A man had stopped and gotten the wrong idea about a woman traveling alone, and the situation had resolved itself in a way that left her hands marked and her mood considerably darker than it had been at the start of the evening. He didn't know any of that. He'd assumed what men assume, and she hadn't corrected him because the assumption had been useful. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Green. Sharp, furious, not desperate, not begging. The eyes of someone who had already decided they weren't going to break tonight, no matter what the world threw at them. The January wind came off the Wyoming basin like a living thing, all teeth and intention, driving sleet sideways across the porch. It was the kind of cold that didn't just chill you, it made decisions for you, it told you what you were made of. Ridley lowered the rifle 2 inches. Not all the way, just enough to make a point. "You got a name, Nora Dane? That's your real name? Does it matter?" "Yeah," he said. "It does." She looked at him steadily. "Then it's my real name, Nora Dane. And I walked 4 miles in this storm to get here because the sign on your gate says Sagebrush Ridge, and I heard in town you might be hiring. Your north fence line is shot to pieces. I saw it on the way in. You've got gaps wide enough to drive a truck through, and maybe 30 head in that south pasture that look like they're deciding whether it's worth the effort to keep standing. So yeah, you need workers. You just don't trust them." Something moved behind his eyes, not softness. Something harder than that. Recognition. "I got 5 men," he said. "Then you've got 6 come morning, or you've got 5 and a problem on your porch." She didn't look away. "Your call, Cole." The sleet picked up. A gust hit the porch so hard it rattled the boards under her feet. Ridley watched her stand through it without stepping back, without hunching her shoulders, without giving the cold a single inch. He should have said no. Every reasonable part of him said no. You didn't take in strangers off a Wyoming road in January, not women with blood on their hands and no past they were willing to name. You didn't let people like that inside your fence line, let alone your house. But there was something in the set of her jaw, something he recognized from old mirrors and harder years. Not hope. Hope was for people who hadn't been hit enough times yet. This was something else. Refusal. Pure and bone-deep refusal to give the world the satisfaction of watching her go down. He'd worn that look once. Back before the bank took the east pasture. Back before the drought of '89 took what the bank hadn't. Back before his father drank himself quiet and left Ridley holding a ranch that bled money like a cut that wouldn't close. "You can sleep on the porch," he said flatly, "or you can sleep inside." He jerked his chin toward the hallway behind him. "My bed. No conditions, no apologies, that's the deal. Take it or leave it." The silence that followed was colder than the storm. Nora looked at him for 3 full seconds. He watched her calculate, watched something pass through those green eyes that was part fury and part something more complicated. Something that had to do with every door that had ever been closed in her face and every choice that had ever been made for her by men who thought they had the right. Then she turned around. She walked to the old wooden bench at the far end of the porch, swept the snow off with her forearm and sat down, pulled her knees up, turned her face away from the wind. "I'll take the porch," she said. Ridley stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to. "Suit yourself," he said. "You'll be dead by morning." "Maybe," she said without looking at him. "But if I'm not, I want breakfast, and then I want to see that fence line." He closed the door. He didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the whiskey bottle going slowly down and the stack of unpaid bills going nowhere, and he listened to the storm work at the roof and tried not to think about the woman sitting on the other side of the wall. The calendar on the kitchen wall still showed October. He hadn't changed it. Didn't see the point. January felt like October anyway. It all felt like the same month, the same year, the same slow losing that had started so gradually he hadn't noticed it was happening until it was most of the way done. Sagebrush Ridge was 300 acres of Wyoming hardpan that his grandfather had claimed, and his father had nearly lost, and Ridley had spent the last 15 years trying to hold together with stubbornness and not much else. The cattle were down to 31 head, maybe less if the count from this week turned out wrong. The equipment was old, the fences were older, his crew was loyal but small, and loyalty didn't fix fence posts or feed cattle when the hay supply ran short in February. Victor Strand had been circling for 2 years. Ridley knew the name the way you know the name of a sickness. Victor Strand owned half the county and wanted the rest. He wore good boots and spoke quietly and had never once in Ridley's experience done his own dirty work. He had lawyers for that. He had a sheriff for that. He had men who drove out at night and cut fence wire and moved cattle in ways that were hard to prove and impossible to ignore. 2 head missing last week, 1 the week before, small enough to question, consistent enough to mean something. Ridley poured the last of the whiskey and stared at the window where the sleet was still hitting like buckshot. At 5 in the morning he put on the coffee. At 5:30 he fried eggs and bacon, more habit than hunger. At 5:45, when the sky outside started bleeding from black to the color of a bruise, he opened the front door. Nora Dane was still there. She was ice pale and shaking so hard her teeth were knocking together, but she was upright, and when she looked up at him, those green eyes were still sharp, still furious, still exactly where they'd been at midnight, pointing straight at him like a challenge he hadn't figured out how to answer yet. "Breakfast," he said. She didn't thank him. She pushed herself off the bench, staggered once when her legs tried to remember what they were for, and walked past him into the warmth of the kitchen. She sat down at the table and ate the way working people eat, fast and without ceremony, fuel not pleasure. When the plate was empty, she looked up. "The fence," she said. "You can barely stand up." "The fence," she said again. He studied her across the table. She had color coming back into her face now, slow and patchy, the way a fire catches when the wood is wet. Her hands were wrapped around the coffee mug and still trembling, but her eyes weren't. "You'll last an hour out there," he said. "Then you lose an hour of work, better than losing another week of fence." She set the mug down. "I'm not asking for a favor. I said I could work. Let me prove it." Ridley pushed back from the table, went to the hook by the door, and got his coat. "Get your jacket," he said, "such as it is." The north pasture was 3 miles of broken country, frozen ground and scrub, fence line that hadn't been fully repaired since the summer before last. Hatch was already out there when they pulled up in the truck, standing at the worst section with his arms crossed and his expression set to somewhere between resigned and disgusted. He was 62 years old and had been working Sagebrush Ridge since before Ridley was born. He had a foreman's face, all deep lines and careful watching, and he turned it toward the truck when Ridley climbed out, and then toward Nora when she climbed out after him. "Who's this?" Hatch said. "New hand," Ridley said. "Nora Dane." Hatch looked at her the way he looked at everything on this ranch, which was to say thoroughly and without rushing to any conclusions. "She know fences?" "Says she does. Lot of people say things." Nora had already walked past both of them and was standing at the worst gap in the line, 30 feet of downed wire and rotted posts, studying it the way a doctor studies a wound. She reached down and tested the tension on a piece of wire, then looked at the angle of the remaining posts, then looked north along the line to where the next gap started. "You got posts in the barn," she said. "South side," Hatch said, watching her. "Wire? Bed of the truck." She nodded once and went to get the hammer. For the first hour, nobody helped her. The men stood back, Hatch with his arms still crossed, Birch and Decker leaning against the truck with the particular watchfulness of men who have seen newcomers come and go and have learned not to invest too early. Levi, the youngest, 20 years old, and still at the stage where he wanted to help everything, had to be told twice by Hatch to stay put. Nora didn't acknowledge any of it. She worked the fence the way she'd eaten breakfast, no wasted motion, no performance. She pulled wire with both hands and set it tight as a piano string. She drove staples with 3 clean strikes each, no more, no less. When a post snapped at the base, she dragged a new one from the barn, 60 pounds of rough-cut timber, and set it herself without asking for help or waiting to see if anyone would offer. By the time the second hour came, Hatch had uncrossed his arms. By hour 3, without anyone saying a word, Birch had picked up the other hammer. By noon, she'd closed 2 gaps. By mid-afternoon, 5. The men worked beside her now, not because Ridley told them to, but because standing still while she moved felt like a kind of shame none of them had words for. Even old Coop, who was 70 and moved like a man with a grudge against his own joints, pitched in on the posts, grumbling steadily about the cold and people who didn't know when to quit. When the light died and Ridley called it, they'd repaired more fence in one day than they'd managed in the previous 2 weeks. Nora stood in the truck bed as they drove back, hands bleeding through improvised wrapping, face marked with cold and effort, looking out over the pasture with an expression that was hard to read but had something in it that wasn't quite satisfaction. More like recognition, like the land was looking back at her. "Not bad," Hatch said quietly when they reached the barn. Nora glanced at him. "Not done." He almost smiled. "No," he said. "Guess it's not." She jumped down from the truck bed, landed hard and didn't wince. "Where's the bunkhouse?" she said. "East side," Ridley said. "You'll share with." "I don't share." He looked at her. Wasn't a question. Neither was that. She met his eyes without any particular heat, just clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where your lines are and having held them long enough that they don't feel like lines anymore, just the shape of who you are. Hatch cleared his throat. There's the old tack room, end of the barn. Private. Ain't much, but it locks. Nora looked at Ridley. He held her gaze for a moment, then gave a single nod. Tack room, he said. She took it without another word. The room smelled like saddle leather and decades of quiet. It was barely 12 feet wide, with a cot that had seen better years, a space heater that worked when it felt like it, and a window that looked out over the north pasture toward the darkness where the fence line ran. Nora sat on the cot in the dark for a while without turning on the light. She could hear the men in the bunkhouse through the barn wall, low voices and the occasional laugh, the sound of a radio playing something with a steel guitar. She caught fragments. Words like strange and quiet and wonder where she came from and that horse the way she was with Ash today. She hadn't planned the horse. Ash had been a problem that had presented itself when she walked past the far paddock on her way back from the fence line. A black horse pressed into the corner with his sides heaving and his eyes showing white. 3 men keeping their distance and Levi looking like he was trying to figure out how to be useful without getting killed. She'd gone in because going in was the obvious thing, and she'd talked to Ash the way her father had taught her to talk to frightened things, which was quietly and without asking anything immediately, just being present until the animal decided you weren't a threat. It had worked. It always worked if you were patient enough. What she hadn't expected was for Ridley to be watching from the gate the whole time. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and took out the photograph. It was old enough that the edges had softened and the colors had gone to something between sepia and ash. A man standing in front of a gate, one hand resting on the post, squinting against the sun with the relaxed squint of a man who owned the light he was standing in. Beside him, barely reaching his elbow, a small girl with dark hair and the look of someone who had never yet been told there were things she couldn't do. The gate behind them read Sagebrush Ridge. Nora looked at it for a long time. Then she put it back in her pocket and lay down on the cot without taking off her boots and stared at the ceiling while the space heater clicked and sputtered and eventually caught. Her father had told her about this place the way some men talk about a woman they loved and lost. Not with bitterness exactly, though the bitterness was there underneath everything, the way a root system is there under grass. Mostly he talked about it with a kind of wonder, like he still couldn't fully believe it had happened. Like some part of him kept expecting it to be undone. David Dane had built Sagebrush Ridge from nothing, starting in 1964 with land that nobody else wanted and a stubbornness that made men either admire him or stay out of his way. He'd drilled his own well, built his own structures, run his own cattle, and done it all without owing money to anyone who mattered. He had water rights on the northern creek that made the land worth twice what the acreage suggested. He had plans. In 1971, those plans stopped. He'd never been entirely clear on exactly how it happened. Or maybe he'd been clear and Nora had been too young to understand the shape of what he was describing. A deal that wasn't a deal. Men with papers that looked legal and weren't. A payment that appeared in a bank account he'd never opened, used as evidence of a sale he'd never made. Lawyers who were expensive and judges who were unavailable in a county where certain names carried more weight than the law. When it was over, Garrett Cole, Ridley's grandfather, had the deed. David Dane had a truck, a daughter not yet born, and 30 years of telling anyone who would listen that the land had been stolen. Most people stopped listening after the first few years. Nora had never stopped. She'd been born in 1972, the year after her father lost the ranch, and she had grown up on the stories the way other children grew up on fairy tales. Except these stories didn't have dragons, just men with briefcases and a sheriff who looked the other way. Her father had worked whatever work he could find, always moving, always chasing wages that never quite caught up to the anger he was carrying. He'd been a good man, careful and patient and decent in ways that the world hadn't rewarded. He'd died 3 months ago in a rented room in Laramie with nothing to his name except a box of documents he'd been assembling for 30 years. Nora had read every page of that box. Then she'd driven to Sagebrush Ridge in January. She wasn't here to burn it down. She'd thought she was back in October when the grief was still fresh and hot, and she'd been making lists of everything that had been taken and calculating what justice ought to look like. But somewhere between the Laramie Motel and the front door of this ranch, the math had changed on her. You couldn't build something from ashes. You could only add to the ash pile. She needed proof first. Real proof, the kind that held up outside of a dead man's handwriting and his daughter's conviction. The original survey records, the water rights documentation. Something that showed the transfer of 1971 wasn't just irregular but fraudulent, built on forgery and payments that went in directions they were never supposed to go. The proof was here. She was certain of it. On this land, in its history, in the shape of what had happened to it. She just needed time. 3 days into the work, Nora noticed something she hadn't been looking for. She was in the south pasture checking water troughs in the pre-dawn dark, ice pick in hand, when she counted the cattle. It was something her father had taught her young, the habit of counting. Not because anyone asked her to, but because a good rancher always knows the number. You know the number and you watch it the way you watch a slow leak, and when it drops you know before anyone else that something is wrong. 29 head Tuesday evening. 27 head Wednesday morning. She didn't say anything at breakfast. She ate her eggs and watched Ridley's face while Hatch gave him the week's count. And she watched Hatch say 29 the same way a man says something he believes. And she understood that the foreman hadn't noticed yet. She noticed. She went back out after breakfast and walked the south fence line slowly, reading the ground. The mud at the western corner was disturbed in ways that weren't consistent with cattle moving on their own. There were tire tracks just outside the fence, faint but there, pressed into the frozen earth where a heavy vehicle had stopped and idled. At dinner that evening, she heard Ridley say the name for the first time. He and Hatch were talking at the other end of the bunkhouse table, their voices low, not trying to be private but not including anyone else either. She caught it in pieces. Something about the western boundary, something about a letter from a lawyer. Then Hatch said, "Strand's not going to wait much longer, Ridley. Man's been circling this place for 2 years." Nora's hand tightened around her fork. She kept eating, kept her eyes on her plate, kept her face exactly where it needed to be, which was blank and tired and belonging to a woman who was thinking about nothing more complicated than getting through another cold night. But her hand was tight on the fork, and inside her chest something had gone very still. Victor Strand. Her father had written that name in his documents 11 times. She'd counted. Always in the same context. Always connected to the same transaction. Always to the same 1971 deal that had left David Dane with nothing. Strand's father had been the architect. Victor Strand had inherited the enterprise, the land holdings, the connections, and apparently the appetite. She had known he was still operating in this county. She had not known how close he was to completing what his father had started. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay on the cot and listened to the wind and thought about timelines. Strand had been pushing on Ridley for 2 years. Ridley was holding, but barely. The cattle disappearing in ones and twos was the kind of pressure that didn't make headlines but added up over a season into something that could break a man's budget and his nerves simultaneously. She had seen it in Ridley's face at dinner, not fear exactly, but the particular tiredness of a man who has been fighting the same battle for so long that he started to wonder if winning is even a thing that happens to people like him. She understood that feeling. She understood it better than she wanted to. On the 5th night, when the temperature dropped to somewhere that made the space heater seem like a suggestion rather than a solution, Nora pulled on 2 extra layers and went out into the dark. She went north. She walked the pasture with a flashlight whose beam she kept pointed low, reading the terrain by feel as much as sight. Her father had described this land in detail, the way you describe a home you've lost, every rise and fall of it, every place where the grass grew different or the soil changed. He'd told her about the north section like it was a map to somewhere sacred, the old spring, the line of stones that marked the original property boundary before it was moved on paper, and the foundation. She found it after 40 minutes of searching. It was half buried under decades of scrub and neglect, but the stones were there, solid and deliberate, the outline of something that had been built to last by someone who believed they were going to be here forever. The foundation of the original house. The house her father had started building in 1967 before the money ran short. Before everything ran short, she knelt in the frozen dirt and put her bare hands on the stones. They were cold enough to hurt. She didn't move them. This was real. This was proof of something. Not the legal kind, not yet, but the kind that mattered underneath the legal kind. Someone had lived here. Someone had built here. Someone had believed in this ground enough to lay stones down and plan a future on them. Her father had not been inventing something. "What are you doing out here?" She spun around. Ridley stood 20 feet away with a rifle in his hands and the moon throwing enough light to show his expression, which was not friendly. "Couldn't sleep," she said, "so you walked a mile north in the middle of the night." "Fresh air." "Try again." She stood slowly, keeping her hands visible, not because she was afraid of the rifle particularly, but because this was a man who was already holding more suspicion of her than he'd shown, and there was no point in adding to it. "I wanted to see the land," she said. "I work it. I should know it." "You've been here less than a week. I learned fast." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her at the foundation. Something shifted in his face when he saw it. Something she couldn't quite name. Not surprise. More like the expression of a man who has known something was there and has been carefully not looking at it for a very long time. "That's been there since before my grandfather's time," he said quietly. "He never said much about what was here before us. He said it like a statement. Nora heard it like a question that had been living in him for years without ever finding the right moment to become spoken. "What do you think was here?" she said. He looked at her. "Doesn't matter what I think. I've got enough to deal with in the present without digging through the past. Sometimes the past is what's causing the present." Ridley was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the scrub between them. "Get back to the tack room," he said. "It's 20 degrees. He turned and started back toward the house. Then he stopped without looking at her. "Dane, yeah, next time you want to wander around at night, tell someone. Strand's got men who come through this property. I'd rather not explain to Hatch why I shot our best worker." He kept walking. Nora stood at the foundation for another minute after he was gone. She looked at the stones in the moonlight, at the shape of what had been built and lost and grown over. Then she walked back to the tack room. She lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about what she'd seen in his face when he looked at those stones. The careful blankness of a man who had been told all his life that things were one way and who had developed somewhere along the years a quiet and private doubt that he had never spoken to anyone. He didn't know. She was increasingly certain of that. Whatever his grandfather had done, whatever his father had known or not known, Ridley Cole had been handed this land and this life and had spent himself trying to hold it together without ever asking the question that might have changed everything. She didn't know whether that made what she was here to do easier or harder. The days that followed built on each other the way good work does, each one adding to the shape of something that was starting to look like a going concern rather than a slow disaster. The fences came together section by section. The cattle count stabilized, at least for the moment. The crew developed a rhythm that included Nora in it, not because anyone decided it should, but because she was consistently there and consistently useful, and that was enough. She learned the men the way she learned the land, carefully and from observation. Hatch was the easiest to read and the hardest to impress, which made him the most reliable measure of her progress. When he stopped pointing out what she'd done wrong and started just moving on to the next task, she understood she'd passed some threshold he hadn't announced. Levi was earnest and quick and would go as far as whoever was leading him, which meant he needed the right direction more than he needed anything else. Birch and Decker were brothers who communicated in a private shorthand of glances and half-sentences that had developed over years of working beside each other, and once she learned to read the shorthand, she found them easy to work with. Coop was the most complicated. He moved slowly and complained constantly, but his hands were the steadiest on the ranch, and his eye for structural problems in fence line and equipment was better than anyone else's, including Ridley's. She filed all of it away. And at night, when the bunkhouse went quiet and the tack room was her own, she spread her father's documents across the cot and worked. She'd driven into town twice on her days off, spent hours in the basement of the county courthouse pulling survey records. What she found confirmed what she'd suspected. The 1964 filing showed the Northern Creek boundary running exactly where her father had always said it ran. The 1973 amendment, filed by a clerk whose name appeared on several other suspicious transfers that year, moved that boundary 40 feet east on paper. 40 feet that represented 3,000 acres of effective water rights, moved quietly in the middle of a stack of routine filings in a year when nobody was looking for it. The water rights were the key. They always had been. The land without the water was worth something. The land with the water was worth considerably more, and in Wyoming's climate, the difference between having reliable water and not having it was the difference between a viable operation and a slow failure. Whoever had arranged the 1971 transfer had understood that, had arranged the boundary amendment 2 years later when the original transaction was settled and the dust had cleared, had been methodical about it in the way that people are methodical when they're building something they intend to keep. Garrett Cole, Edmund Strand. 2 names, 1 scheme, 30 years of benefit. She needed the original documents, the ones that showed the connection, the payment, the arrangement. Those wouldn't be in the courthouse, where they'd have faced scrutiny. They'd be somewhere private. Somewhere that served as leverage the way corrupt men keep their evidence of corruption close, because the evidence cuts both ways and the threat of exposure is what keeps everyone in line. Victor Strand's office. She was thinking about how to approach that problem when she heard the boots on the gravel outside. The knock on the tack room door was quiet. Not the knock of someone who wanted to wake the ranch. The knock of someone who had been standing outside for a while deciding whether to knock at all. "Come in," she said, and swept the documents under the pillow in one smooth motion before the door opened. Hatch stood in the doorway. He was still dressed, which meant he hadn't been to bed, and he had his hat in his hands, turning it slowly at the brim. She had never seen Hatch with his hat in his hands before. He wore it the way some men wear their dignity, like something it cost them to remove. She sat up on the cot. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the floor. Then he looked at her again, and she saw in his face something that surprised her, because it wasn't suspicion, and it wasn't hostility. It was the expression of a man carrying something heavy who has finally found the person he was supposed to hand it to. "I knew your father," he said. The room went very quiet. "David Dane was a good man," Hatch continued. "Best horseman I ever worked for. Fair, patient. The kind of man who remembered your name and asked about your family." He paused. "I worked this land when it was his before. I was 19 years old and I didn't understand what I was watching happen. And then it happened and I understood it fine, and it was too late to be useful." Nora didn't speak. She didn't trust what would come out if she did. "Whatever you came here for," Hatch said, "be careful how fast you chase it." He turned his hat one more time. "This land's got a long memory. So do the men who want it." He put his hat back on and walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. Nora sat in the dark tack room for a long time after that, with the documents still under the pillow and the photograph still in her jacket and the shape of what she'd been carrying for 25 years suddenly feeling like something that had weight and edges and was real in a way it hadn't quite been before. She pressed her palms flat on the cot on either side of her. Her father hadn't been wrong. She had always believed him. That was different from knowing. And she had not until this moment fully understood the distance between the two. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across Sagebrush Ridge the way it had been moving across this ground for a century. Indifferent and permanent, the way weather is permanent, the way land is permanent, outlasting every story told about it and every hand that claimed it. Nora Dane was going to get this right, however long it took. 3 weeks of silence has a weight to it. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of a ranch settling into its rhythms, but the silence of something coiling. Nora felt it in the mornings when she went out before dawn to count the cattle, and felt it in the evenings when Ridley sat at the kitchen table with his bills and his ledgers and the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic that never comes out right. She felt it in the way Hatch watched the western road when he thought nobody was looking, and in the way Coop cleaned his rifle every night now instead of every week. Sagebrush Ridge was waiting for something to hit it. Nora worked through it the way she worked through everything, which was straight ahead, and without letting anyone see the calculation running behind her eyes. Days belonged to the ranch. She fixed what broke, fed what needed feeding, moved through the work with the efficiency she'd developed over a lifetime of doing things herself, because there was no one else to do them. The crew had stopped watching her with that careful newcomer assessment by the end of the 2nd week. She was just part of the machinery, and that was exactly where she needed to be. Nights belonged to her father. She had the documents spread on the cot every evening after the bunkhouse went quiet, cross-referencing what she'd found in the county record archives with what she could observe on the ground. The north pasture, the creek line, the fence placement that didn't quite match what the 1964 survey said it should. Small things, each one explainable on its own, that added up in a direction she recognized. On the 22nd day, the cattle count dropped again. Not by 2 this time, by 4 overnight from a pasture that Levi had been watching until midnight. She found the tracks before Hatch found the cattle, or didn't find them, which was more accurate. The same pattern as before, the same careful erasure of obvious sign, but she'd been studying this land long enough now to read the subtler language of disturbed ground and bent grass and the particular way frozen mud cracks when weight crosses it and then thaws and refreezes. They'd come from the north this time, through the gap in the fence line that Birch had marked for repair and hadn't gotten to yet. She brought it to Ridley directly, bypassing the morning routine, finding him in the equipment shed before breakfast. 4 head, she said. North pasture. They came through the upper fence gap sometime between midnight and 3. He put down the wrench he'd been holding. You're sure? I walked the line this morning. Same approach as the south pasture incident 2 weeks ago. Same technique, same exit strategy, different entry point. Ridley was quiet for a moment. Hatch said the count was stable. Hatch counted at dusk. I counted at dawn. She kept her voice level. Someone's rotating their entry points. They're not random. They're testing where we're watching and where we're not. He looked at her steadily. She had noticed over the past 3 weeks that Ridley Cole did not look away from difficult things. It was one of the things she had come to understand about him against her intentions, because understanding the man complicated the plan, and complicated plans had a way of becoming something other than what they started as. But she'd noticed it anyway. He looked at hard things straight on, absorbed them, turned them over, and then responded with a directness that had no performance in it, no posturings, just the thing itself. It's Strand's men, he said. Yes. You knew that before you came to tell me, yes. He picked up the wrench again, then set it back down. All right, we set a trap. Tonight we move 15 head to the north pasture close to the gap. Make it look like we haven't noticed the fence is down. Make it easy. Everyone takes a position and we wait. And when they come, we get them on the property doing what they're doing with witnesses. And then we call the sheriff. Nora said nothing for a moment. What? He said. Nothing. You're thinking something. I'm thinking the sheriff might not be the solution we're hoping for, she said carefully. But let's try it your way first. The trap took 2 days to set up properly, positions established, signals agreed on, the fence gap left exactly as it was with the appearance of neglect intact. Ridley put Hatch south with Birch, Decker on the eastern ridge, Coop by the water trough with a line of sight to the gap. Nora took the rocks above the north approach with a rifle she'd borrowed from the gun rack and a night scope Hatch had produced from somewhere without explaining where he'd gotten it. Levi was back at the ranch house with the radio, ready to call the sheriff the moment they had confirmation. They settled in at 8 o'clock, and the temperature dropped steadily toward something that made the previous nights feel mild. Nora lay flat on a limestone shelf with the rifle across her arms and listened to the land. Wyoming at night in January had a particular quality of stillness, not peaceful but watchful, like the pause before a sentence that ends badly. She had spent enough nights outdoors to stop fighting it and just exist inside it. The hours moved slowly. She thought about her father lying on a cot in Laramie, which was probably not so different from this cot in terms of comfort, working through his documents the way she worked through hers, building the same case from the same side, and never quite getting close enough to make it stick. She thought about the way he'd described this land in those last years, when the anger had mostly burned down to something quieter and more persistent, the embers kind. He'd talked about the North Creek, about the way the light came off the ridge in September, about the smell of the grass in July after rain. He'd talked about it like someone who was trying to keep something alive by describing it accurately enough. She thought she understood that now in a way she hadn't before she arrived. They came at 2 in the morning, 3 riders, moving quiet out of the northwest, walking their horses slow enough that the hoofbeats barely registered against the wind. She picked them up in the scope at 150 yards, watched them spread into a practiced formation as they approached the gap, 1 on each side and 1 through the center. These were not opportunists. These were men who had done this before in exactly this way on exactly this kind of night. She keyed the small radio. 3 riders, north approach, moving to the gap now. Ridley's voice came back low and even. Hold, let them through. She held. The fence gap swallowed them one by one. She watched them move into the north pasture, watched the nearest rider pull a rope from his saddle, watched them begin the practiced work of separating cattle from the herd with the efficiency of men who were paid well to be good at something illegal. They're cutting the herd, she said into the radio. Hold. She held, though every muscle in her body was arguing against it. Now, Ridley said, the lights came on. Every truck headlight, every work lamp, every portable spotlight they had, all of it at once, turning the north pasture into something between daylight and exposure. The riders' horses screamed and reared. The cattle scattered. For 1/2 second there was nothing but chaos and white light and the sound of men swearing at animals that had stopped listening to them. Don't move, Ridley's voice came through the loudspeaker, flat and carrying. You're on private property. Stay where you are. The riders didn't stay where they were. They turned and they ran. The gunfire started almost immediately, not aimed shots but discouragement shots. Crack and flash in the white-lit dark, meant to scatter and confuse rather than hit anything. Nora was already moving her scope, tracking the nearest rider, when the second rider's gun found something it wasn't looking for, and she heard the sound that a bullet makes when it hits an engine block, which is different from all the other sounds a bullet makes, heavier and more final. One of the trucks went dead. They're running, Hatch shouted from somewhere south. North, she called back. They're heading north, back through the gap. She sighted on the nearest horse and then deliberately moved the barrel up and to the left. She would not shoot the horse. The horse had made no choices tonight. She fired twice into the ground ahead of the lead rider, and he swerved hard, lost a second, and that second was enough for Birch and Decker to close the angle on the eastern side and force him back toward the center of the pasture. The firefight lasted 90 seconds. Then they were gone back through the gap and into the dark, leaving behind 2 spooked cattle, a damaged truck, a set of wire cutters with a rubber grip, and a coil of rope that one of the riders had dropped when his horse went sideways. Nora climbed down from the rocks. Ridley was standing at the gap when she reached him, rifle lowered, face unreadable in the aftermath of the lights. Hatch was collecting the dropped equipment. Coop was talking to the cattle in the low, continuous murmur he used that seemed to work on them the same way Nora's voice worked on Ash. Anyone hurt? Ridley said. Birch took a graze on the arm, Hatch said. A line of torn skin rather than a hole, but bleeding steadily in the cold. He'll live. Get him inside. Ridley looked at the wire cutters in Hatch's hand. Bag that. All of it. He turned to look at Nora. Nice shooting. I missed everything I aimed at. You aimed at the ground, he said. Seems like you hit it. The sheriff arrived at 9 the next morning in a county vehicle that had been washed recently, which said something about how he'd spent the previous evening. He was a man in his 50s with a careful face, and the kind of posture that comes from a long practice of standing in rooms where he wasn't going to do anything about what he'd just been told. He looked at the wire cutters. He looked at the rope. He listened to Ridley explain the night's events with the particular expression of a man, counting the seconds until he could leave. When Ridley finished, the sheriff said, You got nothing here that tells me who these riders were. 3 men came onto my property and stole my cattle and shot at my crew. You shot back from what you're telling me. Far as the law sees it, both parties discharged weapons. That's a mutual situation. They came through my fence at 2 in the morning with a rope and wire cutters. Fence was already down. You said so yourself. The sheriff picked up his hat from the table and put it on. I'd recommend fixing your fences, Mr. Cole, and maybe not setting up situations that lead to gunfights. That's the kind of advice that keeps a man out of trouble. He drove away. Ridley stood in the yard for a long time after the cruiser turned onto the main road and disappeared. Nora stood beside him. The cold settled around them both with the particular patience of cold that knows it has already won the argument. Neither of them spoke for a while. 15 years, Ridley said finally. Not to her particularly, just to the air, to the road, to the space where the cruiser had been. Nora waited. I've been fighting this for 15 years. My father fought it before me, and a man with a badge just stood in my kitchen and told me that doesn't count for anything. He stopped, looked at the road, looked at the land around him, 300 acres of Wyoming hardpan that had taken everything he had and kept taking. I set a clean trap. I had witnesses. I had physical evidence, and he told me I had nothing. He told you the system he works in isn't going to help you, Nora said carefully. That's not the same thing. He looked at her. Then what good is any of it? She held his gaze. It's what we build on from here. The system said no. That doesn't mean we're out of options. It means we find options that don't go through the system. He studied her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not trust exactly, but the consideration of it. The opening of a door that hadn't been opened before. Then he turned and went inside without another word. Nora stood in the yard a moment longer. She had seen in his face just before he turned, something she recognized from her own mirror in the months after her father died. The look of a person who has been doing the right things and watching them fail, and who is running out of ways to explain to themselves why they should keep doing the right things when the wrong things seem to be winning. She knew how to fight that feeling because she'd had to learn. You fought it by finding the next move. Not the right move in the abstract, not the move that should have worked, but the actual next move that was available to you right now, given the situation you were actually in. The next move was Victor Strand's office. She found Ridley in the back room 2 hours later at the filing cabinet, the lamp throwing yellow light over his hands and the papers around them and the lines in his face, which looked deeper than usual in that light. Strand's going to come at you legally next, she said from the doorway. He set this up so that the sheriff option is closed. The next step is paperwork, lawyers, something that looks like process but isn't. Ridley didn't look up. I've been expecting that. How much time do you think you have? Days, maybe a week. He closed a drawer, opened another. He's been patient for 2 years. I embarrassed him last night, even if the sheriff didn't do anything about it. Men like Strand don't absorb embarrassment quietly. Then we need to move first. He looked up. Strand has records, Nora said. The real ones. Whatever he's been using to manage these land acquisitions, the documents that show how he operates, they're not all in the county courthouse because not all of them would survive scrutiny there. He keeps his own files. His office in town. You're suggesting we go into his office. I'm suggesting we retrieve evidence of crimes he committed. The framing depends on who you ask. Ridley looked at her for a long moment. How do you know he keeps records there? Because men like Strand always keep records close. They're leverage. Against the people he's bribed, against the officials he's compromised. It's how he maintains control. The threat of exposure is what keeps everyone in line, which means he needs the exposure material to be accessible to him. She met his eyes. I can get in. How? He doesn't know who I am. I'm a ranch hand who's been working for you for 3 weeks. I can go in as someone who wants to sell information about your operation. Someone who's angry about the money and the work and thinks you're going to lose anyway and wants to be on the right side of what comes next. Ridley was quiet. You'd be walking in alone, he said. Yes, with no legal standing, no backup that can act in time. Coop can get into a safe, she said. He mentioned it last week, in passing. I don't think he meant to say it out loud, but he said it clearly enough. If Coop opens the safe and we photograph what's inside, we have documentation. Ridley turned back to the filing cabinet and stood there with his hands on the edge of the drawer, not looking at anything in particular. She could see the weight of the decision in the set of his shoulders. You're going in wired, he said finally. Radio tracker in your boot, mic on the chain around your neck. We're outside and if anything goes wrong, we pull you out. He might search me. Then we improvise. But you're not going in dark. He turned to face her. Coop goes in the back with Levi. Not alone. Agreed. And if Strand makes you, then I run and you come get me. He studied her. Why are you doing this? This isn't your ranch. You've been here 3 weeks. The question was direct enough that a simple lie wouldn't fit it. She had been careful so far, careful about what she said and what she left out. But there were moments where the direct question required something closer to the truth, if not the whole truth. I've seen what happens to places like this, she said. When men like Strand get them, the land doesn't change, but everything that was built on it gets erased. The work people did, the history of it, the fact that something was built here that mattered. She kept her voice steady. I don't like watching that happen, and I can help stop it. Ridley looked at her for another long moment. Then he nodded once. The small, decisive nod she'd learned meant the conversation was over and the work was beginning. We go in 2 days, he said. Today we prepare. They spent the afternoon with Coop in the barn. The old man produced his old skills with the matter-of-fact quality of someone recounting a career they'd moved on from but hadn't quite left behind. His hands were good, still steady despite his age, and he talked through the mechanics of combination locks with the patience of a man who understood that knowing something well enough to do it was different from knowing it well enough to explain it. Levi listened with the focused expression of a young man trying to memorize something that might matter later. That evening, Ridley sat on the porch steps after supper for the first time Nora had seen him do it. Not working, not moving, just sitting in the cold air looking out at the land. She walked past him on her way back from checking on Ash and did not stop, but she felt him watching her go and felt, without turning around, the quality of that watching, which was different from the watchfulness of the first days. Less evaluation, more something she didn't have a clean word for. She walked on. The night before they went into town, the fire started. She smelled it before she saw it. She was in the tack room reviewing the plan one more time, running through contingencies, when the particular sharpness of old wood catching reached her through the barn wall. Different from the wood stove smell she'd grown up with. Faster and more certain, she was out of the tack room before she was fully upright. The east wing of the main house was already running flame up the siding when she came around the barn. Orange light throwing shadows across the yard that moved the way living things move, fluid and purposeful. The fire had caught the old paint and the older wood beneath it with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting for exactly this fuel. Ridley's truck was still in the yard, which meant he was still inside. She didn't stop to think about it. The kitchen door was unlocked. The smoke inside was thicker than the outside had suggested, the kind that fills the low spaces first and works upward, and she dropped to her knees without being told and moved through the kitchen by memory and the sound of Ridley's coughing somewhere ahead in the corridor. She found him in the back room. The filing cabinet was open and he was pulling folders into a metal box with the focused speed of a man who had already decided this was worth doing and was not revisiting the decision. "Leave it," she said. "These are the only records I have. Ridley, the deed, the water documentation. Everything." He kept pulling. "I leave these, I've got nothing to fight with." She understood it. She didn't agree with it. She grabbed his arm with both hands. "The ceiling," she said. He heard it too then. The sound that timber makes when the math of weight and heat stops working in your favor. A low sustained groan that was the structure above them renegotiating its relationship with gravity. He grabbed the metal box and came. They made it to the doorway. The ceiling came down. Not all of it. A single beam, the main cross timber above the back room, coming down in a cascade of plaster and ember that caught Nora across the left leg as she shoved Ridley through the door ahead of her. She'd seen it coming. Half a second of warning, enough to push him clear but not enough to be clear herself. The impact arrived a half second after it happened. The body takes a moment to understand catastrophic input. She went down hard on the hallway floor, one knee and then both hands, and looked back to see the beam across her lower leg, could feel its weight, could feel the heat through her jeans. "Nora!" Ridley dropped the metal box and came back through the doorway. The smoke was thicker now, the orange everywhere, the ceiling above them making sounds that meant they had very little time. He got his shoulder under the beam, his face went red, the cords in his neck stood out like cables. She could see the effort of it in every line of him, this man who had been holding things together by force of will for 15 years, finding one more thing to hold. The beam moved an inch, then two. She dragged herself backward across the floor, hand over hand, the injured leg dragging, the smoke making her eyes water so badly she was navigating mostly by feel. She got her back against the far wall and pulled the leg clear. Ridley let go of the beam. It came down where she'd been. He got her under the arms and dragged her toward the front door, which was still clear, the fire having started at the back, and worked forward with the patience of something that knows it has time. They came out into the cold air and the world was suddenly very large and very clear, the smoke gone, the stars overhead, the crew running toward them from the barn. Hatch with the hose, Birch and Decker with buckets, Levi standing at the edge of the chaos looking like he needed a direction. Ridley set Nora down on the frozen ground and looked at her leg. She looked at it too. Torn through the denim, bleeding in a way that would need attention, but the boot was intact, and when she flexed her foot, the leg responded. The bone had held. Neither of them said anything. They sat on the frozen ground in front of the house that was becoming something other than a house, and the crew worked the hose and the buckets with the particular grimness of people who understand they can slow a thing but not stop it, and the fire made its decisions about what to keep and what to take. The east wing was gone. The back room was gone. The rest of the structure survived in the way things survive when the people fighting for them refused to stop, damaged and smoke-stained but standing. When it was finally out, and the crew stood in the yard with their hands hanging and their faces gray with ash and effort, Ridley looked at the ruins of the east wing for a long time without speaking. Nora sat on the ground beside him because getting up seemed more complicated than it was worth at the moment, and waited. "Strand," he said finally. "Yes, you're certain. I'm certain that this fire started at the east wall on a night with no lightning and no one smoking inside. I'm certain it went up too fast for a natural cause." She paused. "And I'm certain that the timing, the night before we were planning to move on his office, is not a coincidence." Ridley crouched down beside her, not looking at her, looking at the burned section of house. "He was trying to take away what I'd fight with," he said. "The records, the will to fight." He was quiet for a moment. "If he burned me out, the bank would call the note within 60 days. I'd have nowhere to put the crew, no place to work from. He didn't just want the land, he wanted me to give up." "He's going to be surprised," Nora said. Ridley looked at her then. His face was black with soot, and his eyes were red from the smoke, and he looked like a man who had been taken apart and put back together, slightly differently, which was perhaps accurate. "Yeah," he said. "He is." He helped her up. They walked back to where Hatch was wrapping Levi's hand, which had gotten burned on the hose nozzle, and Coop was sitting on an equipment crate looking his age for the first time since Nora had arrived. "Plan still on?" Hatch said. "Plan moves up," Ridley said. "We go tonight." The night was moonless and deeply cold. Nora drove Ridley's older truck into town alone. Hatch took a second vehicle with Coop and Levi circling wide to come at the building from the back through the alley that the loading dock opened onto. Ridley and Birch were parked 2 blocks from the Strand Land Corporation building, watching the street with the radio open between them. The building was 3 stories of glass and steel that looked expensive and permanent the way things look when they are built by people who have never seriously considered the possibility of losing. The lobby was marble, the receptionist desk was the size of a small car, and the woman behind it had the professional warmth of someone paid to make visitors feel welcomed before they were turned away. Nora went to the desk and said she needed to see Victor Strand, that she had information about Ridley Cole and Sagebrush Ridge, that it was worth his time. She waited 4 minutes. The assistant who came down in the elevator was young and precise and led her up without speaking. The 3rd-floor hallway smelled like money and deliberateness. The corner office had windows that looked out over the county as though the view were a possession, which in some ways it was. Victor Strand was older than she'd expected, mid-60s, silver-haired, with the face of a man who had spent decades becoming comfortable with decisions that didn't cost him anything personally. He was reading something when she was shown in and took his time finishing before he looked up, which was a power gesture so old it had gone past cliché and into habit. He looked at her the way he probably looked at most things, as a potential transaction. "You work for Cole," he said. "Worked," Nora said, past tense. She sat down without being invited. "He's 3 weeks behind on wages. Blamed the cattle losses, which he's blaming on everyone but himself. Man's going under and he's too proud to see it." Strand leaned back in his chair. "And you've decided to be practical about it." "I've decided not to go down with him." She kept her voice flat, the particular flatness of someone whose emotion has curdled into calculations. It was not entirely a performance. The anger was real. She was just aiming it differently than he would assume. "I know where he's running his operation from now that the ranch house is compromised. I know how many men he has, how the cattle are split, and I know his next move." She paused. "He's been trying to find a way to go above the county sheriff to state-level authorities." Something shifted in the quality of Strand's attention. "What do you want?" he said. 5,000 now. 5,000 when you've confirmed everything I'm telling you. And a job managing whatever operation you build on Sagebrush Ridge once you have it." Strand studied her. She could feel the evaluation happening behind his eyes, the weighing and cross-checking. She had built this version of herself carefully on the drive into town, constructed it from genuine frustration and genuine exhaustion and genuine anger, all of which were real, just pointed in a direction he couldn't see. "Where is he running the cattle?" Strand said. She gave him the location of the abandoned homestead. She gave it because they were already planning to move the cattle, had already decided the homestead position was too exposed, and by the time Strand's men arrived, the operation would be elsewhere. She gave him enough truth to make the lie hold. Strand picked up his phone, said something she couldn't quite hear into it, then, "Marcus will pay you. You'll wait here until we've confirmed the location. We agreed on 5 up front. We agreed on 5 and 5. You'll wait for confirmation before the second half." His voice was pleasant and absolute. "You understand?" She understood. Marcus walked her to a room with no windows and a door that locked from the outside. She heard the lock turn. She sat in the chair for exactly 10 seconds. Then she took the thin metal probe from the hem of her jacket, the one she'd sewn there in preparation for exactly this possibility, and went to work on the lock mechanism. Her father had taught her this in a kitchen in Laramie when she was 12 years old, crouching in front of a salvage yard door, explaining that knowing how to open a locked door was as fundamental as knowing how to open a window, just a different kind of situation. She had the door open in 80 seconds. The hallway was empty. She moved quickly but without running toward the back stairwell where Coop and Levi should be by now. She found them on the 3rd floor outside Strand's private office. Coop had the safe open. Levi was photographing documents with the small camera they'd brought, hands steady despite the expression on his face, which was the expression of someone who had committed to something and was not going to be the one who caused it to fail. "We need to go," Nora said quietly. "He's suspicious. 3 minutes. "I need 2, Coop said without looking up. She stood at the office door and watched the hallway. The safe contained what she had expected. County filings with handwritten notations, transaction records for accounts that didn't correspond to any public entity. And near the back of the main compartment, something that made her breath catch for just a moment before she pulled her attention back to the corridor. A document with a name she knew, David Dane, and beside it a payment record dated 1971, payable to Garrett Cole. "Close it," she said. "We go now." Coop spun the dial and stood in one motion. Levi was already at the door. They went down the back stairs in a tight, fast descent and emerged into the loading dock alley just as the alarm inside the building began. Someone had found the empty room. They ran for the vehicle, and the vehicle was not where they'd left it, which was a problem that lasted exactly 5 seconds before Ridley's truck came around the corner, at the kind of speed that is technically illegal and practically necessary. "Get in," he said. They got in. The truck made 3 turns in quick succession, and by the time Strand's security reached the street, there was nothing to see but an ordinary vehicle on an ordinary road heading into the dark, wide county beyond the edge of town. They drove for 20 minutes before anyone spoke. In the cab beside Ridley, Nora watched the road and held the camera and thought about what she'd seen and what it meant. The payment record wasn't just evidence of what Strand's father had done. It was evidence of what Garrett Cole had accepted. Both families, both complicit, and one daughter with a dead father and a box of documents who had knocked on the wrong door in the right storm and spent 3 weeks becoming something she hadn't entirely planned to become. She took a breath. "I need to show you something," she said. Ridley kept his eyes on the road. She told him what Levi had photographed, told him about the payment record. Did not look at his face while she told him, kept her eyes forward, because she had learned enough about him to know that this would not be information he received quietly, and she needed to be finished before she looked at him. When she stopped speaking, the truck was silent for a long time. Then Ridley said very quietly, "How long have you known?" "Which part?" she said, though she knew which part he meant. "About this land, about your father, about why you came here." Nora looked at her hands in her lap, at the camera, at the road unrolling in the headlights. "Since before I knocked on your door," she said. The truck slowed. Then it stopped, in the middle of a county road with nothing on either side but frozen scrub and Wyoming dark, and Ridley got out. He walked 10 feet from the truck and stood there with his back to her, hands at his sides, and she could see in the line of his shoulders the shape of a man absorbing something that was rearranging the architecture of everything he thought he knew. She sat in the truck and let him stand there. He'd earned that. The wind was the only sound, moving across the scrubland, the way it always moved, indifferent to everything standing in it. She thought about what she'd said when he asked her why she was doing this. "I've seen what happens to places like this." It had been true. It just hadn't been the whole truth. And she had come to understand, somewhere in the past 3 weeks of working beside this man, and sleeping in his barn and learning the names of his cattle, that partial truths have a way of becoming their own kind of lie, and lies have a way of costing more than you budget for them. She was going to have to tell him everything. She'd known it since the night he found her at the foundation stones and said, with such careful quietness, that his grandfather had never talked about what was on this land before them. She'd known it then, and she'd been carrying it since, adding to the weight of it every day. And now the weight had become something that was going to have to be set down whether she chose to or not. She just needed him to still be standing when it was. The radio crackled. Hatch's voice came through with an urgency that cut through everything else. "Boss, you copy. Strand's people just showed up at the homestead. 20 men, minimum. 3 vehicles. They're surrounding the position." A pause. And Ridley, they knew exactly where to go. Didn't search. Came straight in. Ridley turned around and got back in the truck. He looked at her once. A look that held everything that was going to have to be said eventually, and the acknowledgement that eventually was not now. "We finish this," he said. "Then we talk." He picked up the radio and told Hatch to scatter the cattle into the north timber. Told Birch and Decker to pull back to the ridge, told Levi to stay with the second truck and wait. Then he turned the truck northwest, toward roads that went from paved to gravel to the memory of a road, toward the old mines that her father had worked the last 2 seasons before he lost everything, toward the secondary shaft that her father had described in detail on a dozen different evenings, the way a man describes a place he believes he'll never see again, but wants to keep real by describing it accurately. The mining operation had closed in 1979. What remained was the kind of abandonment that Wyoming absorbed without comment, structures returning to the elements with a certain dignity that came from the dry climate and the unhurried pace of it. The main shaft entrance was sealed, but the secondary access on the north face was a cut in the rock, narrow and low, half concealed by 2 decades of scrub that had moved into the clearing the mining activity had made. She found it on the second pass, on foot, flashlight pointed low. "Here," she said. They went in single file, the passage tight enough that Ridley had to turn sideways for the first stretch, and then it opened into the secondary shaft, 8 feet across and high enough to stand in, the timber supports old but preserved by the dry underground air in a way the outdoor structures had not been. The emergency radio setup was on the east wall, military surplus from the look of it. The casing was dented and dusty, and the power cable ran to a generator bolted to the rock wall and apparently not touched since the mine closed. Levi found the hand crank before anyone suggested he look. "I can get this running," he said. "How long?" Ridley said. "I don't know. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe not at all." "Start now." While Levi worked, Coop sat on a rock shelf and looked at the photographs they'd printed before leaving the ranch. He looked at the payment record page for a long time. "Garrett Cole," he said, not a question. "Yes," Nora said. "I worked for Garrett Cole for 3 years. Coop set the photograph down. He was a hard man, the kind of smart that makes itself invisible inside a legal framework. He was quiet for a moment. "I always wondered how he got this land. Paid cash in a year when nobody was paying cash. Just always wondered and never asked." Ridley was standing near the entrance with his back to the group. Nora watched him the way she'd learned to watch him, in the peripheral way you observe something you don't want to appear to be studying. He was still, the particular stillness of a man whose internal landscape was undergoing something significant, and who had enough discipline to keep it off his face while other people needed him functional. She had done that to him, carried this into his life and detonated it in the middle of a winter that was already taking everything it could get. She did not regret coming. She could not. Her father's voice was too present in this place, in this landscape he'd described so carefully for so long, for her to regret the thing she'd come to do. But she understood, standing in a cold mine shaft with the sound of Levi working the generator crank behind her, that the cost of what she'd done was not abstract. It had a name, and it was standing 10 feet away from her, holding everything together the way he'd apparently been holding everything together his entire adult life. Because that was what he did, and he didn't put it down. "Ridley," she said. He turned. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." He looked at her for a moment. "We'll talk about it. Not now. I know. I just needed to say it now. While there are still things I don't know how you'll take." He held her gaze. "Is there more?" "There might be, when you've seen everything." The generator coughed, then caught, a rough industrial sound that bounced off the rock walls and then settled into something almost rhythmic, and the radio console clicked to life with a wash of static that after 20 years felt close to miraculous. Levi let out a breath that had been held for some time. "It's live." Finding the right frequency took longer than finding the generator. Static and dead bands, and once a fragment of country music that seemed impossibly ordinary. Nora ran the dial while Levi stabilized the power draw and Coop watched the entrance. She found a federal emergency channel at 11 minutes past 3 in the morning. She keyed the mic. "This is a civilian emergency broadcast requesting federal response. Location is the Redstone Mining Road north of Sagebrush Ridge Ranch, Carbon County, Wyoming. We have documented evidence of land fraud, bribery of public officials, and assault by Victor Strand of Strand Land Corporation, requesting immediate federal law enforcement response. Please acknowledge." Static. Then a voice, female professional carrying the quality of someone trained to receive unusual calls without projecting alarm into them. "Civilian broadcast on Federal Emergency Channel. This is FBI Field Communications out of Casper. Identify yourself and repeat your location." Nora repeated everything. She added Strand's name, the nature of the fraud, the duration, the involvement of the county sheriff's office, and the fact that Strand's men were currently surrounding a position on private property approximately 2 miles south of their location. "Copy that, civilian. Stay on this channel. We are initiating response protocol. Estimated arrival to your area is 45 minutes. Can you maintain your position?" "We can maintain," Nora said. She looked at Ridley. 45 minutes. He nodded once. Went to the entrance and looked out at the hillside, calculating what 45 minutes meant against what Strand's men might do. They heard the vehicles at 30 minutes. Not from the south. From the west. Headlights moving through the scrub below the ridge, 3 sets moving slowly but with purpose. "They found the trucks," Ridley said. "They found roughly where we are," Nora said. "They don't know the secondary tunnel. There's another way out. Eastern tunnel. My father described it. Exploratory cut comes out on the backside of the ridge." Ridley made the decision in the way he made most decisions, which was without theater. "Go," he said. "Coop, Levi, bring everything. Nora, you navigate." She took the flashlight and went to the back of the shaft. The eastern tunnel was lower, low enough that they moved bent at the waist for the first stretch. Single file, one hand on the wall. The air was colder than the main shaft and tasted of mineral and deep time. Behind them she could hear distant voices and then something striking rock near the main entrance. They were trying to seal it. Nora moved faster. The tunnel ran longer than her father's description had suggested. There were 2 branches. She chose right at the first because he'd said the eastern passage stayed true. She chose left at the second because she could feel air movement from that direction. And air meant opening, and opening meant outside. The explosion came when they were roughly halfway through. Not inside, above them, a compression of sound and pressure that sent dust from the ceiling and put a crack in the rock wall that she decided not to examine closely. Levi made a sound. Coop said nothing. She kept moving. The air grew less stale. Then she could feel it moving, real and cold, from somewhere ahead that was not rock. She turned a corner and the flashlight caught the outline of an opening, partially blocked by debris and scrub root that had worked through from the surface, but genuinely open. "There," she said. They cleared it in 4 minutes, working with hands and boots and the focused energy of people who can see an exit. Coop went first, then Levi, then Nora. Then Ridley, who went through sideways and emerged onto a hillside that dropped away to the east, away from Strand's vehicles, away from the sealed entrance, into a darkness that felt, after the tunnel, extraordinarily open. They stood on the hillside and breathed. Below them, on the west side of the ridge, the lights were still moving. Figures near the shaft entrance. The aftermath of the explosive charge in the disturbed rock around the opening. They had tried to seal them in. They were outside. Then the helicopters came. 3 of them, running lights sharp in the black sky from the southeast at a speed that said federal rather than local. They swept over the mining road and the spotlights came on and the loudspeaker boomed across the hillside and the scrubland and everything standing in it. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. All individuals, drop your weapons and move away from your vehicles. You are surrounded. Comply immediately." Below them, the coherent shape of Strand's operation came apart. Some men ran. Most didn't. Federal vehicles were coming up the county road from the south, more than she could count, and it was clear within minutes that whoever had planned this response had planned it to leave no gaps. She heard Ridley exhale beside her. Not relief exactly, something older than relief. The sound of a weight being set down and the body registering for the first time how heavy it had been. It took 40 minutes for the agents to secure Strand's men and locate the crew on the eastern slope. The agent who found them was a woman in her 40s with the compact efficiency of someone who had been doing hard work in difficult conditions long enough that neither registered as remarkable. She looked at the four of them, covered in mine dust and cold, and the dishevelment of people who had been through several things in rapid succession. "Which one of you called this in?" she said. "I did," Nora said. "You have documentation, photographs of documents from Victor Strand's private safe, payment records, county filings, boundary survey amendments, evidence of fraud going back to 1971. We're going to need all of it. You'll have it." They found Victor Strand at the homestead, which was where he'd gone when his mining operation went silent. He was in one of his trucks with 2 lawyers and the county sheriff, who had apparently called when the federal response materialized. The sheriff's presence there, with Strand in the middle of the night, said everything it needed to say about the relationship. Nora watched from 30 yards away as the federal agents put Victor Strand in handcuffs. He was calm about it. Calmer than she'd expected. The calm of a man who had spent a lifetime believing that situations could be managed if you knew the right people and said the right things, and who was in the process of revising that belief in real time. She watched the revision happening in his face, the slow replacement of confidence with something he didn't have a practiced expression for. She thought about her father writing that name 11 times in documents that nobody in any official capacity had ever taken seriously. She thought about the handwriting getting smaller and more careful as the years went on, as though he was trying to take up less space in his own anger. She thought about the photograph, the man and the girl and the gate. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to, had imagined this moment in the abstract with something like satisfaction attached to it. But standing in the cold at 4 a.m. with mine dust in her hair and the sound of federal agents processing the scene around her, what she felt was much quieter. Something closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten your arms were tired. The statements took 3 hours. The agents were thorough and unhurried in the way of people building something that needs to hold up, and they took everything Nora had with the careful attention of people who recognized the shape of what they were looking at. The photographs from Strand's safe, the documents from her father's box, the survey records from the courthouse, and the recording from the wire she'd worn into Strand's office. The agent who reviewed the recording played it through twice, made a note, and said, "This is going to be useful." At 7 a.m, the lead agent sat across from Ridley and Nora in a room at the county building that was not the room the sheriff was in. She put a folder on the table. "Based on the documentation you've provided, and pending formal legal proceedings, the preponderance of evidence indicates that the 1971 transfer of Sagebrush Ridge from David Dane was executed through fraudulent means, including a forged bank record, falsified survey amendments, and payments made to county officials to facilitate the transfer and suppress subsequent legal challenge." She spoke with the precision of someone who understood that the words they were choosing would matter later. "The legal title to the property is therefore invalid at its root. Under Wyoming statute, in cases of fraudulent transfer, the property reverts to the original owner or their legal heir." She looked at Nora. "David Dane's daughter," she said. Ridley sat beside Nora and did not speak. After the agent left, they sat alone in the room. The fluorescent light made everything look like something happening in a waiting room, which in a sense it was. Nora looked at the table, at her hands, at the folder. Ridley reached into his jacket. He put an envelope on the table between them. Letter-sized, yellowed at the edges, sealed with tape that had dried and re-adhered imperfectly over what looked like many years. No name on the outside. "I found this in the box of records I pulled from the fire," he said. "Been carrying it for 3 days. Didn't know how to give it to you. What is it?" "A letter. My father wrote it. I recognized his handwriting." He paused. "I didn't open it. I don't know what's in it. But I think it was meant to be found. I think it was meant to find you." She picked it up. The tape gave with the dryness of age. Inside was a single page, handwritten in the small, careful script of a man choosing words with the knowledge that they might be the most important words he ever wrote. Ridley's father had written the letter in 1998, 4 years before he died. He had written about his own father, Garrett Cole, and about the deal made in 1971, and about the payment and the deed and the way he had grown up knowing, not quite knowing, but knowing in the way children know things adults believe they've hidden, that the ground beneath the family name was not as solid as it appeared. He had written about David Dane, not as someone he'd known, but as a name he'd heard spoken in a particular way his entire childhood, the way people speak names they're trying not to think about. He had written, "I am ashamed of what my father did. I am ashamed that I understood it and said nothing. I am ashamed that I gave my son a life built on someone else's loss and told him it was inheritance." He had written, "If Sarah Dane's daughter ever finds this land, give it back. I don't deserve to die clean, but maybe you can live clean." He had written Sarah instead of Nora. He had not known her name. He had known there was a daughter. He had known it mattered. Nora set the letter down on the table and looked at it. "He got my mother's name wrong," she said. "Yeah, but he knew." She pressed one hand flat on the letter. "He knew the whole time." "He did." She was quiet for a moment. The words were too many and too large and needed to be sorted before she let them out. "This land was your life," she finally said. "You held it together for 15 years with nothing but stubbornness and a crew that should have left twice over and didn't. You didn't know it wasn't yours. None of what your grandfather did was your fault." "No," he said. "But what happens next is..." She looked at him. "The FBI is right," he said. "Legally, it's yours. Proper proceedings, several months, but at the end of it, it's yours. And I'm not going to fight that. I'm not going to sit in a room with the truth in front of me and choose not to deal with it. My grandfather did that. My father did that. I'm not going to. Ridley, I'll move the crew off. Give them time to find Ridley." She said it more firmly. He stopped. She looked at him across the table, at this man who had given her a porch in a blizzard and worked beside her for weeks and never once done a small thing when a large one was called for. "I'm not taking you off this land." He looked at her carefully. "My father wanted justice," she said. "He wanted the truth acknowledged. He wanted the record corrected. He spent 30 years trying to get those things through systems that were built to deny them to him, and it broke him in ways that never healed." She picked up the letter, looked at it once more, and set it down. "I don't want what broke him. I want what he actually deserved, which was for someone to look at what happened and say, yes, that was wrong, and here is what we do about it. I'm saying that, I know. And what I'm doing about it is offering you a partnership. 50%. Your knowledge, your crew, your 15 years of understanding how this land works. My legal title, my father's name restored to the record." She looked at him directly. "We run it together. Sagebrush Ridge, what it was supposed to be." The room was very quiet. Ridley looked at the letter, then at Nora. Then at something that wasn't in the room, some internal place where the calculations of pride and practicality, and something more than both of those, were being worked through in the particular privacy of a man who doesn't let his face do his thinking. Then he said 50%. 50%. "I'm not taking charity. It's not charity. Coop can't run a fence line alone. Levi needs 3 more years before he can manage a herd. Birch and Decker are good men who need direction. And you know this land the way I know it from the outside, from stories from a photograph and a box of documents." She kept her voice even. "I need what you know. You need what I have. That is a partnership. That is not charity." He was quiet for another moment, then he put his hand on the table, open palm up. She looked at it. Then she put her hand in his, not a handshake, something more deliberate than a handshake. Two people choosing to go in the same direction, which is harder than it sounds and rarer than it should be. "Partners," he said. "Partners," she said. They drove back to Sagebrush Ridge in the early morning light, the sky going from gray to something warmer over the ridge to the east, and the land coming visible in stages the way it does in winter morning, slowly and without apology for how long it takes. The burned east wing was still there, black and skeletal against the pale sky, and it would be there for a while. Some things took time to clear, but the barn was intact. The cattle, scattered into the north timber the night before, were already being gathered by Birch and Levi, their voices carrying across the cold air as they worked. Hatch was standing at the barn door with coffee in both hands, and he handed one to Ridley when they pulled up and looked at Nora with the steady, assessing look he'd been giving her since the first morning she'd proved she could work a fence line. "So," he said. "So," Nora said. "We still got a ranch to run." "We do." He handed her the second coffee. She took it. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing in the legal world moved at the speed the events preceding it had moved, which was perhaps appropriate, since speed had nearly gotten all of them killed. The federal case against Victor Strand expanded as the evidence was processed, pulling in the county sheriff, 2 commissioners, a judge, and half a dozen other parties whose names Nora recognized from her father's documents. It was, the lead agent told her at their second meeting, one of the most comprehensive rural corruption cases the Casper field office had handled in 30 years. She thought her father would have found that satisfying. She found it satisfying on his behalf, which was a different and quieter thing. During those months the ranch ran, not easily. Nothing about it was easy, and nobody pretended it was. There were disagreements about the cattle rotation and disagreements about fence repair priorities, and at least one significant argument about whether to take on a hay contract that Nora thought was overpriced and Ridley thought was necessary. They resolved it the way they resolved most things, which was by both of them making their full case and then looking at the numbers until the numbers told them something. And in this case, the numbers told them Nora was right. And Ridley said so directly, which was one of the things about him she had come to expect and still found she was grateful for. Hatch watched all of it with the careful attention he brought to everything on this ranch, filing it away in whatever internal ledger he used to track the health of an operation. He did not comment on the partnership arrangement directly. He didn't need to. The fact that he was still there, still showing up before anyone else and staying after everyone else left, was comment enough. Levi grew. Not physically, he was already grown, but in the way that young men grow when they're given work that matters and the space to become competent at it. He started asking questions that were about next season rather than just today, which was when Nora knew he'd started thinking like someone who intended to stay. Birch and Decker repaired the north fence line with a care and precision that went beyond what the work required, and Nora understood that they knew, now, what the north boundary meant and why it needed to be exactly right. Coop supervised from a chair. He moved around the work sites. He did exactly as much as he intended to do and had no plans to do more or less. And what he intended to do was more than it appeared at first glance, because the things he did were always the things that would have cost the most if left undone. The legal proceedings around Sagebrush Ridge were completed in 7 months. The title was transferred formally to Nora Dane, with the partnership agreement filed simultaneously. The county record was corrected to reflect David Dane as the original and rightful owner of the property, and the 1971 transfer was formally annotated as fraudulent. She drove to Laramie the week after the transfer was finalized. The cemetery was on the west edge of town, modest and well-maintained, the kind of place that took its responsibility to the people in its care seriously without making a production of it. Her father's plot was toward the back, under a cottonwood that would be leafed out by spring, and she stood at the headstone for a long time without saying anything because she had learned from him that the things that mattered most were often the ones you didn't need words for. She put her hand on the stone, the way she had put her hands on the foundation stones in the dark that first night at Sagebrush Ridge, real and cold and permanent. She thought about the box of documents he'd spent 30 years assembling, every piece of evidence and every recorded recollection, and every handwritten note made in the patient, diminishing hope that someone would eventually find them useful. She thought about the 11 times he'd written Victor Strand's name, about the handwriting getting smaller and more careful as the years went on, about the way he'd described the ranch, its particular light, its water, its land, with the accuracy of a man trying to keep something real by refusing to let memory soften it. She had come here to finish what he started. She had finished it. Not the way she'd imagined, not the way he'd probably imagined, but in the way that turned out to be possible given the actual shape of the world, which was rarely the shape you'd planned for. She drove back. The rebuild started in March when the ground softened enough to dig. They built the new main structure on a different footprint than the old one, back from the burned foundation, with materials that were better than what the fire had taken. Hatch was particular about the timber, and nobody argued. Levi turned out to have an aptitude for construction that surprised everyone, including Levi, and he became the coordinator of the project in ways that required him to grow into the role and did so visibly, which was satisfying to watch. Coop supervised from his chair, which he moved around the site with the deliberateness of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and wasn't going to be hurried about it. Birch and Decker built the new fence line on the north section with the care of men who understood what the north boundary represented and why it needed to be right. They checked it twice before they signed off on any section, which they had never done before, and which Nora noticed and did not comment on because some things mean more when they're not mentioned. She built herself a small cabin on the north pasture, on the exact footprint of the original foundation she'd found in the dark that first night. 1 room and a porch, with a window that looked south toward the main ranch buildings and east toward where the light came first in the morning. She built it herself over 6 weekends, with Levi on the heavy framing and Hatch advising on the roof pitch, and when it was done she stood on the porch and looked out at the land and felt, for the first time in her life, the specific and particular weight of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not home as inherited, home as chosen, home as earned through something harder than birth and more durable than luck. The water rights on the northern creek were formally restored to the property in June in a filing that made the county record reflect what the land had always known. The creek ran that summer as it should have been running all along, through the north section and down to the lower pasture, feeding the grass that made the north section worth what it was worth. And Nora walked that creek line the first week after the restoration was filed and thought about the 40 feet on paper that had represented so much more than 40 feet. Her father had known about the water, had known it was the thing they'd taken alongside the land, had known what it meant for the long-term value and the long-term viability. He'd been right about all of it. In the systematic and carefully documented way, he'd been right about everything, and nobody with the authority to act on it had listened until now. They were listening now. The herd rebuilt through the summer to 60 head and was on track for 80 by the following year. The equipment was serviced and in some cases replaced. The accounts were not comfortable, but they were functional in a way that left room for decisions rather than requiring every decision to be made by what was immediately necessary. By September, Sagebrush Ridge looked the way a working ranch looks when the people running it have committed to it past the point where giving up is still a rational option. Not perfect, not finished, but alive and pointing in a direction. It was a September evening when Ridley came up to the cabin for the first time since she'd moved in. The summer work had been relentless and good, the herd solid, the fences holding, the legal matters settled. He walked up from the main buildings in the late light with his hat in one hand, and the particular ease of a man who is tired in the right way, the way that comes from doing work that means something. He sat down on the porch steps below where she was sitting. They sat for a while without talking, which was something they'd both gotten better at over the months. The particular skill of being in the same silence without needing to fill it.
Hatch says the North herd's looking good,
Ridley said. Hatch is never going to tell me that directly, Nora said. No. But he told me to tell you, which from Hatch is essentially a standing ovation. She almost smiled. The light was going amber over the western ridge, the color that Wyoming evenings do in September that she'd been watching all summer and had not once gotten tired of. The cattle were visible in the south pasture as small moving shapes she could count from here without trying, the counting habit so deep in her now that it happened without her deciding to do it. 63. All present. You ever regret it? Ridley said. Choosing the porch, she thought about that first night. The cold that had been a living thing. The choice between two options that were both, in their different ways, forms of surrender. The bench with its coat of snow and the dignity of a decision made on her own terms. Every day, she said. And never, he looked at her. That's not an answer. It's the only one that's true. She looked out at the land. Every day because the porch was cold and I could have been inside. Never because everything that mattered came after I chose it. She paused. You regret asking it? Every day, he said. It was a cruel thing to ask, yes, and I knew it was cruel when I asked it. Yes, I was testing you, he said. I know, I was testing you back. She looked at him. You passed. He was quiet for a moment. How? You let me choose. You didn't push when I chose wrong by your lights. You made breakfast anyway. She turned her gaze back to the land. That told me more about who you were than anything you've said since. The last light was going now, the amber deepening into something between orange and red, the colors her father had described when he talked about this land. The evening colors he'd said you couldn't find exactly anywhere else. Something about the particular angle of the ridge and the dust in the autumn air, and the way the light came off the northern creek when the water was running right. The water was running right this year. For the first time in more than 20 years, the water was running the way it was supposed to run, through land that had a correct and honest record in the county courthouse, feeding grass that grew on ground that had been acknowledged as belonging to the people who had built on it. Her father had loved this land. She was going to do something better than love it. She was going to tend it. She was going to know it the way you know a thing when you've worked it in every season, and argued about it, and bled for it, and sat up at night worried about it, and then watched it come through. That was a different kind of knowing than love. It was the kind that didn't require the thing to be perfect or to stay the same. It was the kind that included the hard years and the dry summers and the fences that always needed more work than you thought they would, and the cattle that wandered and the equipment that broke at the wrong times. She had arrived in a blizzard and shoveled manure and fixed fence posts and argued about cattle prices and pulled a man out of a burning house and sat in a mine shaft waiting for federal helicopters and built a cabin with her own hands on the exact spot where her father's dream had started. She knew this land's mud and cold and difficult spring and relentless winter, and the way the north fence always needed more work than you planned for, and the way Ash liked to be approached from the left in the morning, and the way the creek ran different in March than October, and the sound the wind made coming off the ridge at night. Her father had described that sound. She had listened to the description for 25 years without hearing the thing itself. Now she heard it every night. He had been right about everything he'd described. The accuracy of his memory, preserved over 30 years of loss and longing, had turned out to be exact, which meant he had paid attention with everything he had to the years he'd had here, and had carried what he'd observed with perfect fidelity through everything that came after. Through all the years and all the losing and all the small defeats that add up to a life that went differently than it was supposed to. He had paid attention, and he had remembered, and he had kept telling the story, even when no one was listening, because the story was true, and true things deserved to be told, even when it cost something. She had listened. She had come. She had found the foundation stones in the dark, exactly where he said they'd be. The porch light came on behind her, the one she'd wired herself 3 weeks ago on a Sunday afternoon when the electrical work was the last thing left to finish. It threw a rectangle of warm yellow onto the porch boards and out into the dark grass beyond. Ridley looked at it. You did that yourself, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd seen her working on it. Took 2 Sundays and 1 trip back to town for parts I forgot, she said. But yes. He nodded the way he nodded when something confirmed something he'd already thought. Then he looked back out at the land, the way they'd both been looking at it. The way you look at something you're responsible for and relieved to find still there. Your father would have liked it, he said. The light. She thought about that. About David Dane standing in front of this gate in a photograph taken by someone she'd never known, his hand on the post, squinting in the sun with the easy squint of a man who believed he owned the light he was standing in. He had owned it, for a while, and then it had been taken, and he'd spent the rest of his life knowing it and not being able to prove it in any way that the world was obligated to acknowledge. But it was here. The light was here. The land was here. The foundation stones were under her cabin floor, incorporated into the structure the way history gets incorporated into things that are built on top of it, present whether acknowledged or not, load-bearing in ways that don't always show. He would have liked the water rights more, she said. Ridley made a sound that was almost a laugh. Practical man. He was. Practical and patient and decent, and he never got what he deserved in any of the ways the world usually measures what a person deserves. She looked at the land, but the land knew. The land kept the record the way it keeps everything, in the shape of the soil and the way the water moves through it and the fence lines that don't quite match the survey because someone moved them on paper, but the ground didn't move. She paused. He would have liked knowing the ground kept his record. Ridley was quiet for a while. The evening settled around them, the cattle invisible now in the dark pasture but audible, the occasional sound of them shifting and moving, carrying across the cold air. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. "What, that first morning? When you came in from the porch and sat down at the table." He looked at his hands. "You didn't say anything. You just ate. And I was sitting there, trying to figure out who you were and what you wanted and whether I was going to regret letting you in, and you just ate like it was the most ordinary thing in the world to be sitting at a stranger's table after surviving a Wyoming winter night on his porch." "It was the most ordinary thing in the world," Nora said. "I was hungry." He looked at her. "You weren't afraid of me. I'm not afraid of many things. Most people are afraid of me, or at least careful around me. Hatch is the only one who isn't, and he's been here long enough that he's earned the right." Ridley shook his head. "You walked in the first morning like you already knew the kitchen." She had. That was the thing she hadn't been able to tell him. She had grown up hearing her father describe that kitchen, the layout of it, the window over the sink that looked out toward the north pasture, the hook by the door where the coats went. She had walked in like she knew it because in some sense she did, built from someone else's memory carried carefully over a lifetime of loss. She didn't say that now. Some things could wait. "I knew what kind of man you were by the time I sat down," she said instead. "Anyone who makes breakfast for someone they just threatened to shoot is complicated in an interesting way. That's a low bar. You'd be surprised." The stars were coming out overhead the way they come out in Wyoming, which is fully and without reservation. The sky going from black to the particular deep black that is full of light rather than absence of it. Her father had described the stars here too. He had been right about those as well. Everything he had told her, every detail he had preserved through 30 years of distance and loss, had turned out to be accurate. The land had not changed in its fundamental nature. The ridge was where he said it was. The creek ran the way he said it ran. The grass in the north section was the way he described it. The evening light was exactly what he had tried to put into words on a dozen evenings in a dozen different rented rooms. He had described it so that she would recognize it when she found it. She had found it. She was sitting on a porch she'd built herself on the foundation he'd laid, looking out at the same stars he'd looked at, in the same light he'd carried in his memory for 30 years. And the land below her was in the county record under the right name. And the creek was running where it was supposed to run. And the fence lines matched the original survey. And the man sitting on the steps below her was someone her father, given enough seasons to observe him, would have come around to. He had told her to take it back. She had. Not the way he'd meant, not by herself, not by fighting the same battles he'd fought through the same systems that had denied him. She had done it differently, through unlikely alliance and collective risk, and the particular kind of stubbornness that refuses to choose between justice and something worth building. She had taken it back and made it something. The porch light held its yellow rectangle out into the dark grass, and the stars held their positions overhead, and Sagebrush Ridge held itself steady under all of it. 300 acres of Wyoming hardpan that had outlasted every story told about it and every hand that had claimed it, and would outlast every story still to be told. Permanent in the way that land is permanent, which is to say long past the measure of any single life, but shaped, always, by the lives that move across it. Her father had moved across it. She was moving across it now. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was the thing he'd been trying to preserve all those years, not just the legal claim but the facta of it, the reality of a man and his daughter standing in front of a gate, hand on the post, owning the light. She owned it now. She was going to tend it for as long as she had, and she was going to pass on what she knew about it. And someday the person she passed it to would stand on this porch, or one like it, and look out at the same land and the same light and know that it had been looked after. That was what her father had wanted. That was what she had come here to give him. The wind moved off the ridge the way it always moved, the sound her father had described, exactly as he'd said it was, carrying across the land toward her and past her, and on into the dark beyond, the way wind does, indifferent to everything standing in it, and moving through everything just the same. She sat in it and let it move through her, real and cold and hers.